Hello. 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 Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone. Hi. Hello. How is everyone? Happy Monday, everyone. Welcome to session 11 on nutritional biochemistry's lectures, and we are nearly there. Couple of more weeks, and only exam would be left. And I hope everybody's taking care of yourself as we move along and learn more about our amazing body. I hope you had chance to look at this short video and classify some of the neurotransmitters with that knowledge and with your previous knowledge, but we will cover it a little as we move along today. And in the post-lecture activities, apart from the routine quiz, I encourage you to do this case study. So in your final exam, you will have two case studies, and one of them is going to be based on neurotransmitters. So this one will kind of set you up for that. And then in week 13, I'll again do a Q&A webinar to discuss the exemplar, which is given in your exam preparation guide. So we will attempt the answers for that together. Okay, so our plan for today, we will learn more about neurotransmitters. What are they? What do they do? What are the different classes? What are their functions? And then, the functioning of these neurotransmitters is quite complex. We are still unraveling the mystery. But for this session, I have restricted the discussion on very few of them. I'm trying to emphasize what are their components, what are we synthesizing them from, and what are their cofactors. Even regarding this last point, relevance for mental health, we have kept it quite general just to get an overview. What is the current research and what are we learning? Which neurotransmitter is associated with which cognitive condition? When you move on in your clinical subject, you will know the detailed biochemical pathways and whether excess or shortage of these neurotransmitters is an issue. So this first slide is just listing the name of those neurotransmitters that we plan to discuss today. I use it kind of to share it with my clients sometime because it may get confusing which one is controlling which aspect of our mind and body. So it is not exhaustive, but just the main one. Like adrenaline, we are all aware, noradrenaline for concentration. Again, dopamine is that everybody's aware about. Glutamate for memory and acetylcholine for learning. So did you watch that video about classification of neurotransmitter? Okay, no problems, Tracy. You can take a screenshot of this additional slide that I have taken a screenshot from Humphreys et al., one of my references for this lecture. Now, see, these neurotransmitters can be classified on the basis of various factors. One of them is their molecular structure. We haven't been able to measure the total number of neurotransmitters. Why? Because there are billions of them. They are kind of the stars in our Milky Way. And kind of we are releasing them all the time in different situations. So even regarding classification, there is no universal agreement among the researchers and psychologists. So this diagram is telling us about the classification on the basis of molecular structure. So we have those one that we actually use as amino acids, simply amino acid, okay? Main one here are aspartic acid, and it is considered excitatory. And we'll delve into deeper which ones are called excitatory. So that is another classification. Glycine is considered inhibitory, one of our favorite in the clinics. Glutamic acid. Now this one you would notice that in the research and even in the slides, sometimes we say glutamine, sometimes we say glutamate, and here we have written glutamic acid. So there are minute differences in the molecular structure. When glutamic acid as an amino acid, it acts as a neurotransmitter, that's glutamate. Okay? Then GABA is another inhibitory one. Peptides, peptides are when we tie one amino acid to the other. There are long chains. They can be a dipeptide, tripeptide, polypeptide. So these are some of the examples of neurotransmitters that we are making from peptides. Then norepinephrine, dopamine, serotonin we call as biogenic amines. I am not aware why they are called biogenic. Maybe because we are synthesizing them again from an amino acid, but we are adding to its structure. So it's more complicated. The structure is little more complicated than a simple amino acid. And then we have acetylcholine. So what are these neurotransmitters? Would anybody like to comment? What do we know about them so far? Okay. Uh, Thank you, Jane. Yes, they pass signal. See, the more and more I am a student of nutritional biochemistry, okay, for 15, 20 years. And as I've shared with you earlier, I learn new things daily. And more I'm realizing that there are a lot of signaling happening in our body. Uh, So remember last week, we talked about cytokines that are chemical messengers between the immune cells and our front fighters. So these neurotransmitters are also chemical messengers. They are also carrying out a signaling, but their mode of action is happening in the neurons. So as the name suggests, they transmit information between the nerve cell, because nerve cells, they don't have a direct contact with each other. They are substances which neurons use to communicate with one another. And how they are doing it? They are doing it when they are crossing the synaptic cleft between the end of the nerve cell. I hope you would be able to recall that neuron has this structure. It has got a axon, and then there is a dendritic cell, and it goes on. So it is there in the next slide. So this is the one. So in this way, kind of this one axon cannot talk to the other one. So there is a gap in between, and that is what we call as synaptic cleft. And sometimes this communication is called as a synapse, because the two neurons are talking to each other. Okay. Sorry, I have this little cough going on since last week. Now, fascinating thing is that neurotransmitters are synthesized in and released from the nerve endings into the synaptic cleft as and when we require them, which is actually all the time. When you are listening to this slide, you are trying to concentrate. I am trying to remember what all I have to share with you. So all the time, my neurons and your neurons are going tick, 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 tick. So what's happening is that neurotransmitters are synthesized at the presynaptic nerve terminal. Here are some vesicles where they are synthesized. And then with the help of a calcium channel, there is a change in the gradient. They know when they have to release it, body needs it. So that neurotransmitter is released and it comes in this synaptic cleft. Okay? So there is a regulated release of neurotransmitter in the synaptic space. So it's in itself is a quite complex process. Now, what happens is now there are receptors for all different kind of neurotransmitters on the other side, which is the, for kind of understanding, we call it as post-synaptic neuron. So that is at the receiving end. Interesting thing is that one neurotransmitter can attach to more than one type of receptor. And remember what I was just saying in the previous slide, that we are learning daily new things. Now what we have understood is that whether the neurotransmitter is excitatory or inhibitory is actually predominantly dependent upon the type of receptor it binds to. Okay? Just remember it at the back of your mind, because later you might be at a webinar or a seminar where you would learn more about this, because that's the thing we know thus far. Okay? So, and then there is a way in which there is a termination of action. So once its role has been played out, it has to stop acting. So there is a sequence of events that is happening when a neurotransmitter is active. So electrical signals are traveling along the axon. They are briefly converted into chemical signaling, and then there is a not electromagnetic, but some electric action happening. Why? Because there is a depolarization and polarization of the nerve endings, which decides whether the action of that neurotransmitter is excitatory or inhibitory. Now I have spoken some jargons here. Polarization and depolarization, what do I mean by that? And how is that relevant from nutrition perspective? Some of you might know this, but I have kind of added little bit of my animations. I thought I would not do my horrible drawing, but rather take help of PowerPoint. See, let's imagine that this is the cell membrane of a neuron. And remember, there are ions on either side of the cell membrane. So there is sodium, potassium, chloride, and all kinds of iron. But I'm going to talk about only sodium and potassium here. So a typical neuron, when it is taking a nap, when it is resting, there are more sodium ions outside. Okay? And potassium numbers are more inside the cell membrane. So imagine, now you would imagine that these are ions, so there would be a chemical gradient. There would be a difference inside and outside. Not only this, you can see that these ions have an electric charge. What does that mean? That there is a difference in the electric current in between the cell membrane. So what's happening here is when the neuron is resting, let's say, even when I can't even say when I'm sleeping, because at that time also neurotransmitter are working because we are dreaming. But let's just for understanding say that the neuron is resting. But when some activity is going on, then these sodium ions, they come inside with the help of a channel. Remember in our first session, we talked about sodium channel, potassium channel, all those channels are there in the neurons. So when sodium comes inside, then there is a change in the number of electric charge, and that changes that causes the depolarization, because there is a gain of electrons in the inside of the cell membrane, and that is when the excitation happens, because now there is more charge, there is kind of a fire, and the the neuron, the neurotransmitter, it becomes excitatory. So nerve endings have a excitatory impact. Whereas when it's the other way around, potassiums, they move out, then there is a polarization effect, which dampens the electric charge. So that's what we mean when we are saying that a neurotransmitter has an exciting effect and a inhibitory effect. So in nutrition biochemical terms, we are talking about sodium and potassium. So now we know actually about 50 different endogenous chemicals that we call as neurotransmitters. As I mentioned earlier, we have taken a very simplified version in this session. We are only talking about neurotransmitters. However, some of them now are being classified as neuromodulators and even neural hormones. But for this session, we are going to simply call them as neurotransmitters. So communication between two neurons is happening in the synaptic cleft. And here the electric signals that I just explained in the previous slide, they are traveling across the axon. They are briefly converted into a chemical one, and then through the release of neurotransmitter, it is causing a specific response in the receiving neuron. And after crossing the synaptic cleft, neurotransmitter bind to the receptors on the postsynaptic membrane. And when it binds, there is that opening and closing of the ion channel, which leads to the stimulatory or inhibitory response. So these are some of the neurotransmitters, and we are going to study about acetylcholine, noradrenaline, adrenaline, dopamine, serotonin, and GABA. So this slide is telling us about that other classification. Apart from the structural classification, we can call neurotransmitters as excitatory, inhibitory, or modulatory. Excitatory one promotes generation of electric signal called an action potential in the receiving neuron. And some of them are glutamate, acetylcholine, epinephrine, and norepinephrine. Inhibitory one that prevent the generation of an action potential. That is, there is a dampening of the energy response. We classify glycine and GABA under this category. Some neurotransmitters such as dopamine actually can have both effects. They can be excitatory and they can be inhibitory. And how is it that possible? Remember, I mentioned a couple of slides ago that their effect depends upon the type of receptor they bind. in the postsynaptic cleft or postsynaptic neuron. Okay, questions at this stage, few deep breaths. And if anybody has a question, let's take it before we move on to the next step where we learn more about each of these neurotransmitters. Okay. That's good because I think some of you knew about this thing earlier. So let's move on. First one, we are going to talk about glutamate. So the first slide is talking about its important points, that glutamate is involved in learning and memory. It is one of the excitatory neurotransmitter. It is the most common neurotransmitter in the central nervous system. It is a precursor of GABA, which is an inhibitory amino acid. Half of the neurons in the brain are utilizing glutamate, and we can synthesize it from glutamine or glucose. As always, I have a fun fact written in my notes, which I like to share, that it was discovered by Kikune Ikeda of Tokyo University in 1907. And he was able to discover it when he was looking at flavor common to cheese, meat, and mushroom. And he extracted glutamate for the first time from a seaweed and went on to invent and make a seasoning out of it. I'm sure you're all aware about it. So we are talking about MSG here. Glutamate plays a major role in synaptic plasticity. So it has the ability of strengthening or weakening of signals between neurons over time. The main receptor for glutamate is N-methyl D-aspartate receptor. It is commonly known as NMDA receptor. There's a lot of emerging data about importance of this receptor, but for this session, remember that the name of glutamate receptor is N-methyl D-aspartate receptor. Its main functions are cognition, emotions, sensory information, perception, and motor coordination. So very important for neuronal plasticity. But hey, it is an excitatory neurotransmitter. So one has to be cautious because too much glutamate can actually kill the neuron. Okay? And most of the disease condition where glutamate is associated with, it is causing neural cells to die because body's mechanism to keep it in check are not working properly. So excitotoxicity from glutamate can kill off the neurons, leading to certain disease conditions. Moving on to the way our body is able to synthesize glutamate. So glutamate is a non-essential amino acid. It cannot cross the blood-brain barrier. So neurons have to synthesize it themselves. And glutamine is the precursor which neuron uses. to manufacture glutamate. Okay. And remember in the first slide for glutamate, we mentioned that we can make it from glucose. How is that happening? That's happening from your TCA cycle. As you would recall, I have added this screenshot of TCA cycle, which you have already studied in your biochem, and we will refresh about it next week also. Here, I just want to point out that when we are making glucose to pyruvate, and then from pyruvate, we have this TCA cycle going on, we make various intermediate carbon molecules, alpha ketoglutarate, fumarate, oxaloacetate, and from these carbon compounds, we can make glutamate or glutamine. Actually, this should be two arrows both ways. Okay. So this is what's happening in the neural cell. Maybe that's the reason, if we are having too much sugar at night, and if we are having Halloween, children are consuming a lot of sugary chocolates or things like that, they get hyper excitable. So that could be the reason, because neurons get a lot of glucose and they can convert it into glutamate. Now there is one more important point which I wanted to mention here, that there is a glutamate to glutamine cycle that is continuously happening in the neural cells. And body, because it knows that too much glutamate can be harmful, it can convert glutamate back to glutamine and send it for that TCA cycle. Okay. So there is that to and fro purpose, which has, sorry, what am I saying? There are two purposes of this cycle. If neuron does not need glutamate, it can utilize glutamine to make energy out of it, so that there is not too much glutamate and nerve cells can be protected from its excitatory impact. Now we will look at the pathway where we make glutamate in the latter slide, because we are making glutamate and GABA in the same pathway. So here, a few of the cofactors for neurotransmitter glutamate are listed: glutamine, niacin. I have written vitamin B6 here, but I would like to make a correction in your notes. In all the neurotransmitter synthesis, we are using pyridoxal 5-phosphate. As you would recall from your session 2, that is the active form of vitamin B6. And I must have mentioned there also how important B6 is as a cofactor when we are synthesizing all these neurotransmitters. So if you have a client in future who comes to you with imbalance of neurotransmitter, you notice that they have anxiety issues or depression, then think about vitamin B6 and then zinc. Among branch chain amino acid, they donate amino group when we are synthesizing glutamate. Why is zinc important? Zinc is necessary for the receptors of glutamate to act. That is NMDA. Why I'm expanding on this is that in your case study question in the exam, you might be asked to list some cofactors and then also asked to give a rationale. So it's important to remember the rationale is the function of that cofactor. So zinc is required for the glutamate receptor action. Niacin is important because it's a cofactor in that TCA cycle. Okay, so from there we are generating precursor for manufacturing glutamate. And glutamine is the foundational molecule from which we make glutamate. Okay. Do you like umami flavor? Which is the one that we attribute to monosodium glutamate? Okay, Tracy likes it. I also like it. Day before yesterday, we were at a Thai restaurant and I had something, but it was too salty for me because I think they had a lot of fish sauce, a lot of soy sauce, and if they are not using the low salt one, I found it really salty. And then it had all those veggies. Veggies also have a lot of sodium. And then has anybody heard about MSG insensitivity? Yeah, that redness and one, okay, migraine is also, yes, that's a good point, Jacinta. There is an association of too much glutamate with migraine, and then monosodium glutamate insensitivity. When people go for Asian food, they may have redness, itching, but it subsides within 20 minutes. It's not considered really toxic or harmful. So that's all happening because of that glutamate in MSG. So looking at some of the disease condition that we are aware of now associated with glutamate, lack of glutamate may lead to depression. When somebody faces jet lag frequently, it's owing to low glutamate, difficulty in concentration, lack of enthusiasm. There is also some data coming up that glutamate may be associated with autism. I can't recollect the direct association at this stage, but these are the associations we have now started to make. Excess glutamate is associated with OCC, Alzheimer's, epilepsy, and Huntington disease, which you might have heard is a genetic condition, and patients, they are carrying CAG repeat extension in one of the exons. And symptoms are depression, anxiety, irritability, aggressive behavior, and apathy. Now, the main reason excess glutamate is association with Alzheimer's and Huntington is that glutamate is allowed to act in the neural cell for a long time, and it's damaging the cells there. So cells are being killed off, and then it is associated with Alzheimer's. So that's one mechanisms that are playing up in these disease conditions. And in stroke, you can imagine that there is a blood clot that has reached the brain, which is interfering with the functioning. Again, the neurons that are supposed to manufacture glutamate are damaged. So that's another reason. In epilepsy, there is deficiency of one of the enzymes that is able to take care of excess glutamate. So that's little understanding that we have about glutamate. One of the major symptoms people feel is brain fog. That's kind of known to play a role when somebody has dysregulation of glutamate level. Okay, so a couple of questions here. D is asking, so by making sure we have nutrients needed for glutamate, we reduce the risk of depression, anxiety. Yes. So if we identified a client who is coming to us has lack of glutamate, mostly we try to work with the amino acids and cofactors that are required for synthesizing that particular neurotransmitters. Tracy also has an important question. Would the body upregulate, downregulate the receptors if chronically exposed to glutamate or deficient? See, in normal circumstances, body should be able to transcribe for these receptors. But for some reason, that's what's not happening. Another thing which I mention is that one transporter, one receptor can bind to both excitatory and inhibitory neurotransmitter. And a receptor acts based on the neurotransmitter that binds to it. Okay? So ideally, body should be able to do it. And if there is an issue at the receptor level, we really don't know what could be done. There are some antidepressants and those medications that we do, which are being given, which are actually preventing these neurotransmitters to be present in higher amounts in the particular area. Would there be a neurotransmitter that binds more readily than others? Yes. Yes. That's why for glutamate, we have a specific one. So NMDA has affinity to glutamate. Okay. So yes, they do have affinity for a couple of them. And that's why whenever we are talking about inhibitory or excitatory, we are talking about glutamatergic neurons, you know. I can't pronounce it. So we have the receptors that are specific for acetylcholine. We call them as cholinergic receptor. And the one that like glutamate more, we call them as glutamatergic receptors. So yes, they have an affinity. Any other question? Did I answer you, Tracy? Cool. Moving on to GABA, gamma aminobutyric acid. It is the inhibitory neurotransmitter associated with sleep. You know, most of those sleep and anxiety relieving medication, such as benzodiazepines, they all work by enhancing activity of GABA receptors. and thereby they induce calmness, alleviate anxiety, and relieve insomnia. So, appropriate level of GABA is associated with calmness and rhythm. But interesting fact is that our neurons make GABA from glutamate, and we need pyridoxal 5-phosphate here. So can you see the connection here? Some people who are hyperexcitable, which means that they have low GABA, that might only be simply because of deficiency, that they can't activate vitamin B6. Okay? Or they may be lacking vitamin B6. Then GABA contributes to vision, motor control. It is also stimulating growth hormone, and it has to be there. Body has to have some GABA so that it can counteract that glutamate mediated excitotoxicity. And from your multiple choice question perspective, please remember that the most common inhibitory neurotransmitter in the central nervous system is GABA. Why too much caffeine leads to anxiety? If people consume too much coffee over a long period of time, because caffeine decreases GABA. So caffeine even works at that level, not only sympathetic nervous system, but at neurotransmitter level as well. So body feel more active. So short-term gain, but could have long-term inhibitory effect on GABA. Some of the functions of GABA are listed on this slide here for you. That GABA contributes to motor control, vision, cortical function. It regulates anxiety, modulates sensation of alertness. It helps us relax. It improves sleeps, and one of the reasons is because GABA is the precursor of melatonin. So it's again the same pathway. There is one combined pathway for all of them. I'll try to post it on Loop, saved somewhere, and I'll share it how we are making one neurotransmitter from the other in a chain of events. Now, another interesting fact is that it regulates systemic metabolism. So GABA may have a secondary modulating role via parasympathetic nervous system control, because it can modulate appetite and peristalsis. So activation of GABA receptor mediated signaling in the hypothalamus suppresses food intake and kind of help reduce weight. Quite complicated, but again, if you notice, some people are finding it difficult to reduce weight and all your strategies have failed, then maybe have a look at GABA. This is the flowchart or steps in the synthesis of glutamate and GABA. I don't want you to remember each step, but please remember the initiator molecule. If we start at the top of the diagram, that we can make glutamate from glutamine by using the enzyme alpha-ketoglutarate aminotransferase, and cofactors are magnesium and manganese. Then with the help of glutamate decarboxylase, we make GABA from glutamate. Now, kind of rest of this diagram is showing the conversion or manufacturing of glutamate from the pyruvate cycle or TCA cycle intermediates. Okay? And somewhere you can see it is called as GABA shunt. At some places it is called as glutamine to glutamate cycle. Another important takeaway point from this particular diagram is that when we are making glutamate to GABA, we need B3, pyridoxal 5-phosphate, and taurine. So again, the emphasis is on the cofactors for this subject exam. Now, zinc help release GABA because it activates vitamin B6. It converts B6 pyridoxine into pyridoxal 5-phosphate, and it is also a cofactor of glutamine decarboxylase. This is the enzyme here. Okay, that is making GABA. The magnesium, taurine, glutamine, and other vitamin Bs are also cofactors. You might remember when we were discussing session 5 on microbiome, we did talk about that healthy bacteria, our symbiotic bacteria can manufacture GABA. So that's why if you have clients who are coming to you with anxiety or brain fog, then you may think about, depending upon their diet, you may want to intervene with probiotics because they are going to stimulate production of GABA via gut, and that GABA is bioavailable via gut-brain axis. Okay? Again, if you want to write in your answer in the case study, the dietary intervention would be with probiotics and fermented foods, then your rationale would be because these compounds can aid in manufacturing of GABA, which is an inhibitory neurotransmitter, and via gut-brain axis, it can stabilize excitability or anxiety issues. Looking at some of the significance of GABA in some cognitive issues or mental health issues. So too little GABA is associated with anxiety and anxiety disorders, panic attacks, ADHD, that's the main one that we need to address, addiction, headaches, Parkinson's syndrome, insomnia, PMS also. GABA may be deranged, it may be destabilized. Some antidepressant, as I mentioned earlier, can increase the level of GABA at the receptor site. Now, one more point which I kind of have added this screenshot of an abstract from a study done to understand effect of yoga intervention on GABA level and thereby stabilizing mood of people who had major depressive disorder. The reason I'm sharing this research is, which is a small research, short-term research done on small sample size, is that in your case study, we are always asking about lifestyle intervention. And unfortunately, I noticed that even some of my colleagues, they don't um, pay attention to it more often as I would like to do it. So, so if there is a person who has major depressive disorder, this study was conducted among 15 such people, and then there was a healthy control group, and they both were intervened with a 12-week yoga intervention. And GABA production was measured through magnetic resonance spectroscopy. What they found was that there was enhancement in the mood. So they measured mood and anxiety through a questionnaire. There was a set of questionnaire and they measured it and they found there was improvement in the scores as compared to the non-depressed individual. So this was kind of the first evidence that brain GABA increases associated with yoga and breathing practices could be of benefits among people with major depression. Okay, what do you take away? Your comments from what you have understood so far and little bit of this research finding. Do you think it can be used in the clinic? Yes, it's one point that we would like to, our scientific mind would say that we need to look at the levels more more speculatively. We want to look at more research. Definitely, D. Thank you. We need to look at the basal parameters as well. We also need to look at their diet and whether they were taking any medication. Good point. And yes, Jacinta, it's like after I delve deeper into the research and I make a evidence informed decision as a clinician, then I can educate my client that try normal breathing practices and little bit of yoga maybe in your own time. And I really like that you people are delving deep into the research. Okay? Tracy has another question. What is the turnover time for GABA in the body? No clue, Tracy. I don't know that. I should find out. Thanks for the question, though. Okay. Jacinta is sharing some of her wisdom. Different types of yoga do have different actions. Yes. So there can be restorative or power yoga and deep breathing or fast breathing. They all have different impacts. Very good. So this study should have classified and given more information about the type of that yoga. Okay, Dale is asking a question. Jacinta, could you help? What's more important, breathing or the yoga pose? Yes, because different yoga pose actually goes along with the um, type of muscles. Yes. depend upon the muscles also. Yes, thank you. Yeah. Shall we take a 5 minutes break and everyone do some deep breathing? How are we going? I'll go whatever you want to do. Or maybe after discussing the next one, whatever you say. Yeah, let's all take 5 minutes break and um, do 15 deep breath exercise. Now we talk about catecholamines in this next section. And predominant catecholamines are norepinephrine, epinephrine, and dopamine. So initially we'll talk about adrenaline and noradrenaline that can also act as hormones. They are present in low concentration in the brain. They act as neurotransmitter when produced in the sympathetic nervous system and in the brain. And they are the one we all know, they are responsible for fight and flight response. Now, after that response has subsided, adrenaline can last for up to an hour. Okay, and adrenal, we all know adrenaline is used as an emergency treatment for acute fibrillation, cardiac arrest, in shock, and in the treatment of asthma as well. See, they are the shortest living signaling molecules in the plasma, and their half-life is about 10 to 100 seconds. So apart from being involved in the fight or flight response, they also help in mobilizing energy stores in the form of glucose and free fatty acid in the preparation for physical activity or for recovery from hypoglycemia. It decreases pain sensation. So sometimes, we are running and we hurt ourselves with a thorn or something, and we don't feel the pain unless we are calm and we are sitting down, and then we realize, oh, when did that happen? So in that heat of the movement, because of adrenaline, pain sensations are not felt. It is also responsible for inhibiting the release of mast cells and basophils in type 1 hypersensitivity reactions. That's why it's used as EpiPen. It also acts along with glucagon, and if somebody has low blood glucose level, then it initiates gluconeogenesis, where we make glucose from glycogen. So it's very important in maintaining glucose level in the body. So I'm assuming you all can recollect these pathways from your bioscience lesson. Looking at noradrenaline, it is important for attentiveness, emotions, sleeping, dreaming, and learning. It is the one that is responsible for skeletal muscle contraction. Let us discuss about dopamine. And regarding synthesis of these catecholamines, we will learn together because there are 3 of them and they are made from one amino acid, and that is tyrosine. So dopamine, epinephrine, norepinephrine, their precursor amino acid is tyrosine. And you would recall we can make tyrosine from phenylalanine. So in a way, dopamine is precursor to adrenaline and noradrenaline, because first we make dopamine and then we make the other catecholamines. I'm sure you all have read about it, that This is the neurotransmitter which mediates pleasure in the brain. Dopamine modulates behavior, work memory, cognition, attention. It also inhibits prolactin production. This is the one which modulates mood also. Looking at synthesis of catecholamines, we can synthesize it from tyrosine in the presence of tyrosine hydroxylase. And the cofactors are tetrahydrobiopterin. This compound is, its molecular structure is BH4. Okay? And it is kind of, the structure is similar to folate, and our body can make it inside, and it's cofactor for most of the neurotransmitter. Specifically here, when we make L-DOPA in the first step of making dopamine. Now, tyrosine hydroxylase is the most important enzyme in catecholamine synthesis, and that is the rate limiting step. So if there is deficiency of this amino acid, then this pathway would not progress further. So this is the figure explaining the synthesis pathway of all the catecholamines. So we start with tyrosine, where in the presence of tyrosine hydroxylase enzyme, and look at the cofactor B1, B3, B6, and iron. Remember session 4, iron is required for hydroxylase enzyme. That's the reason here. And this is the same tyrosine which is used in the synthesis of thyroid hormone also. So what can you see here? If somebody has hypothyroidism, so they lack tyrosine, they would also have issues with the neurotransmitter synthesis. So the first step is that we make L-DOPA, and then in the presence of magnesium and pyridoxal 5-phosphate, we make dopamine. Then from dopamine, we can make epinephrine from this enzyme called as dopamine beta hydroxylase that also needs copper and vitamin C. Remember, we talked about that epinephrine needs vitamin C, and people who have too much stress, they may lack vitamin C. So that could be one pathway. And then we make norepinephrine from epinephrine in the presence of B12, semi, and pyridoxal 5-phosphate. So from this diagram, you don't have to look at these medications. So this diagram is also showing the medications and which pathway or enzyme they are inhibiting. Main emphasis is again on the cofactors, and that the starting amino acid for making catecholamines is tyrosine, and the first enzyme is tyrosine hydroxylase. Now it will be a good idea to just click on the link given here on this extra fact about can eating broad beans increase L-DOPA levels in the blood. And it has been long time since I read it and put it there in the slide. So I'm going to rely on you, what you read and tell me here. Take a minute. It's again a small blog reading as I remember. And tell me whether by eating broad beans we can increase DOPA levels in the blood. So this is the article which was conducted on just 5 healthy volunteers and 6 patients with Parkinson disease. And they were given about 250 grams of cooked broad beans after 12 hours without treatment. So this is just an abstract of this particular research. And what's this telling us is that there was improvement in the symptoms and L-DOPA increased in those patients. So actually, these broad beans, approximately 100 grams of fresh or green broad beans may contain 50 to 100 milligrams of L-DOPA. Yes, Jane, I agree that it's really not easy to eat all that broad bean, 250 grams. So maybe we try to take it as a prevention that if we are having a diet rich in this particular veggie, then we are trying to maintain uh, L-DOPA production in the body. Yes, absolutely agree. Not easy to consume that much amount. Does anybody else want to say something? Moving on, various conditions in which these catecholamines may be disrupted their normal levels. So, too much of epinephrine or lack of epinephrine can be associated with anxiety, digestive issues, sleep problems, weight gain, and memory impairment, whereas noradrenaline is associated with depression, fibromyalgia, where there is constant pain, ADHD, anxiety, and decreased cognitive ability. Looking at dopamine, it is association with various eating disorders, self-injury, compulsive sex behavior, internet gaming. The kind of too much dependency is associated with deficiency of dopamine. Depression is the one that we know of, schizophrenia, and Parkinson disease as well. Again, my aim to keep looking out for those lifestyle intervention apart from dietary interventions. I went out and I've taken the screenshot from another small study done in 2011 on anatomically distinct dopamine release during anticipation and experience of peak emotions to music. What do you have to say about that? Would music help in modulating dopamine, giving it some pleasure sensation, and maybe thereby tackling depression or any of the condition associated with imbalance in dopamine? Has anybody heard or read about it or has applied this on yourself? You know, I always used to be so bad at maths. Okay. In my school years, I was terrible. So whenever I was studying for the maths exam, I always had music on. And my friends and family would say, how could you concentrate on maths when you are listening to music? But I was able to, because maybe I was balancing out uh, my anxiety, my fearfulness, and correlating and associating it with pleasure. Good to see that some of you also look at it that way. Jane is saying music heals the soul, so they say. She also uses music to study. Jacinta also need music to go to gym. Yes, I also have music on when I'm doing walking. Stephanie is saying that she does it when she's studying or even sleeping sometime. I guess which neurotransmitter it must be influencing when it's helping to sleep. Could be dopamine, could be GABA also. Kind of these are facts we still to need to put evidence to. I agree. But sometimes these small strategies help. Okay. Great. Listen to music before the next assessment. Moving on to kind of one of our favorite one, because there is so much work out there about serotonin. It is mostly distributed outside of the central nervous system. Okay, only 2% in the central nervous system. And now we know maximum serotonin is coming through the gut via the gut bacteria. We synthesize it from amino acid tryptophan. Its active form or its molecular name is 5-hydroxytryptamine, 5-HTP. That's how we denote it now. It is important for functioning of our lymphocytes. We associate serotonin with cocoa, and it is the one which is precursor to melatonin. Serotonin is known to regulate bowel movement, very important in reducing appetite and a lot of influence on digestion, social behavior, modulates sleep. It's also associated with circadian rhythm. Lot of consistent data that serotonin and irritable bowel syndrome, fibromyalgia, migraine, in all its etiology or pathophysiology, serotonin plays a major role. That's why for tackling IBS, they give SSRIs, serotonin uptake inhibitors, because there is too much serotonin which is not being balanced out. That is leading to irregular bowel movement. You will study in detail about in your clinical subjects, because there are two types of IBS. One is diarrhea dominated and one is constipated dominant. And serotonin is known to play a role in IBS diarrhea subtype. So in fact, now evidence is that if somebody has IBS, we need to tackle neurotransmitter first and then the gut. They have to both go together. Looking at the synthesis of serotonin, so we make it from tryptophan in the presence of enzyme tryptophan hydroxylase. And remember, hydroxylase enzyme need iron. And at this stage, we also need folate, D3, magnesium, ascorbate, calcium. Then we convert it into 5-hydroxytryptophan, which can be converted to serotonin in the presence of pyridoxal 5-phosphate, zinc, and magnesium. And we can convert 5-HTP to serotonin, and from there we make it into melatonin. That's why role of serotonin in sleep also. We have evidence that serotonin, apart from IBS, can also be linked to depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, addiction, hyperactivity disorder, and autism. Our next neurotransmitter that we are discussing today is acetylcholine, which we can synthesize from lecithin, and lecithin, that is a precursor for choline. It is the first neurotransmitter that we discovered, and we make it from acetyl coenzyme A and choline. So remember that these are the initiators for making acetylcholine, and these are in a way rate limiting steps. So if we don't have these molecules, we cannot make this neurotransmitter. It is a very fast acting neurotransmitter at the neuromuscular junction. It is also a neurotransmitter at the sweat glands. It can alter firing of neurons. It acts as a neuromodulator as well, and it is used as a signaling for both central nervous system and peripheral neurons. The two receptors that we know, the receptors that we call as cholinergic receptors, they are nicotinic and muscarinic. And these receptors, actually, they are named on the basis of chemical agents that these receptors can mimic, which is nicotine and muscarine. You don't have to remember. I just thought I'll share it, kind of it's interesting. So acetylcholine worked as a neurotransmitter. It alters neural excitability. It influences synaptic transmission. It coordinates firing groups of neurons in the brain. So it's kind of a checker. It checks the brain speed at which the electrical signals are processed. It modulates your attention. So if you're losing your focus in this session today, maybe you have used up all your acetylcholine and you need to pump it up. How are we synthesizing? How can you pump the production of acetylcholine? Again, go back to your glycolysis and TCA cycle. Remember, where do we make acetyl-CoA? When we are metabolizing glucose and fats and protein. We are converting glucose to pyruvate, and from pyruvate we are making acetyl-CoA. So if there is a fault in somebody who cannot carry out glycolysis, then even synthesis of acetylcholine would be impaired because we would not be making the precursor. Then we add on choline here, and in the presence of enzyme choline acetyl transferase, we make acetylcholine. Again, I'm not expecting that you remember the entire pathway, but remember that what are the starting molecule? Remember the name of choline. Remember that its manufacture is related to glucose metabolism, and other cofactors are listed for you here. So remember that rate limiting step in acetylcholine synthesis is availability of choline and acetyl-CoA, which is actually produced in the mitochondria during TCA or Krebs cycle. And we will discover more about these amazing mitochondria in our next session. Now you can kind of think about various disease conditions in which deficiency of these nutrients or their precursor reactions can play a role, such as disorientation, confused thinking process, Parkinson disease. That's the area where most of the work has been done on acetylcholine. Any question? Okay, now the plan is kind of you take some time to go through the slides, what we have done today, ask any questions, and it will be good idea if you all click on this link and save this article because it's kind of very interesting because it talks about specific foods that are rich in these neurotransmitters. Give it about 10 minutes and each one of you can choose your favorite neurotransmitters and try to find out which are the foods that are rich in that particular nutrients. And meanwhile, in the chat box, I will share some of the other links and articles. So then the aim is that this information can help us develop a dietary intervention for a university student who is stressed. Okay, is that okay? Would it be okay to read just about food sources of one nutrient in next 10 minutes by clicking on this link? I'll also do so. This is the one. I think even PDF is available if you want to have a look. Summarize for our future clients some of the nutrients that this and other research articles and our discussion have helped us accumulate. So my list would have vitamin D at the top, followed by essential fatty acids, omega 3s, then zinc would be another one. SAMe would actually help therapeutically. Magnesium helps in most of these conditions. Zinc, because zinc actually helps in modulating receptors for all these neurotransmitters, such as NMDA. And what else? Mediterranean diet, as you have read through the article. And let's add some of the lifestyles. Have some music, exercise, nature walk as well to boost. And to be very frank, we should be using the word modulate for these neurotransmitters. Because when body is making inhibitory from an excitatory, so that's the body's way of keeping the balance of these neurotransmitters. So just staying and trying to modulate these conversion. So Dale has so much to share with us that he's trying to transition to fruitarianism himself. Okay. Okay. And even diabetics are trying that. Okay. Great. Thanks for sharing, Dale. Does anybody has a question at this stage? Any comments? Anything extra you want to know, which I can post via loop? I know Tracy asked me about the GABA turnover. I would have a look at that. I will post that food article for others also. Okay. Thank you for your time, guys. Have a good week ahead, and I'll see you again on Wednesday. Bye for now.